In physics, an avalanche doesn't actually start when the snow falls. It starts months earlier.
Right, deep inside the ice.
Exactly. In this state of hidden structural failure. On the surface, the mountain looks, well, it looks pristine, completely solid. But underneath, the structural integrity is hollowing out.
It creates a void that's really just waiting for a trigger.
Yeah, and today in this deep dive, we are taking the exact mathematical equations used to predict avalanches, or like the sudden collapse of a jammed grain silo, and we're applying them to human beings.
Which is wild. We are looking through the lens of the Gibsonian theory of accumulation objects. And this is a framework that, well, it stops treating a country like a chaotic debate club of polling data.
Right, and starts treating it like a physical pile of material under extreme pressure,
Yeah.
which is a completely novel way to look at things.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're applying this strict mathematical approach to one specific highly pressurized structure, which is the Russian Federation, using hard data from April 2026.
The numbers are fascinating.
They really are.
Yeah.
But I want to be crystal clear before we go any further. We are not taking political sides regarding the war or international relations today. We are trading ideology for physics here.
Right. Strictly impartial.
Exactly. Our goal is purely to unpack the mathematical and structural models from our sources to understand how human systems hold together and how they eventually fracture. So, okay, let's unpack this. What if a country isn't just opinions, but an actual physical pile of human nodes?
Well, if you want to understand the actual trajectory of a highly coerced society, you really have to look past the illusion of visible stability.
Which is hard to do.
It is. But the Gibsonian theory introduces the concept of the accumulation object. Like when you pour sand into a pile or pack gravel into a bed, it compacts, it jams.
The pieces literally lock together.
Exactly. They lock together to bridge over empty voids. But most importantly, a physical pile will undergo massive hidden internal failure long before the outer contour visibly shifts.
Okay, so the premise is that a nation-state operates on those same physical laws.
Yes, exactly the same laws.
But, I mean, human nodes have to be infinitely more complex than grains of sand. A piece of gravel only cares about gravity and friction.
Right.
A human being factors in fear, the cost of leaving their job, their ideological identity, their need for groceries.
Which is exactly why the model breaks any political system down into 4 distinct measurable surfaces. The first is the occupancy surface.
Okay, occupancy.
Yeah. This is simply the visible contour of the pile. It's what we see on the news. People showing up to work, citizens paying taxes, the visible turnout at a state rally.
So if I'm understanding this, it's like looking at a massive packed snowdrift. The outside surface looks perfectly solid and frozen in place.
That's a great analogy.
Right, but underneath, the temperature is rising and the structural integrity is hollowing out. So the occupancy surface is essentially the optical illusion of stability.
Yes. But to keep people showing up, you need the second layer, which is the lock surface. This measures the gravity of the pile.
The gravity.
Yeah, it calculates the threat of retaliation, state coercion, and what the model calls exit friction.
Exit friction.
Basically, how physically or economically difficult it is to step out of line or just, leave the system entirely.
Okay, and working against that gravity, you have the third layer, which the sources call the failure surface.
Right, the destabilizing load.
Yeah, the hidden accumulation of daily grievances, humiliation, the inability to afford basic needs. It's the internal pressure pushing against the lock.
Exactly. And then the most critical of all is the fourth, the maintenance surface. This is the system's underlying ability to replenish its human substrate.
Replenish its substrate, meaning what exactly?
It measures whether the state can generate enough calories, figuratively and literally, to pay the enforcers, replace exhausted workers, and patch the cracks forming between the nodes.
Wait, I have to stop you there. I mean, I understand the four surfaces conceptually, but how can a mathematical model accurately quantify human grievance?
It's tricky, right?
Yeah. Assigning a highly specific number to something as subjective as exit friction or humiliation feels a bit like, I don't know, we're dressing up psychology in a lab coat and calling it hard science.
Mm.
How do the authors justify turning subjective feelings into hard physics?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the accumulation model isn't actually measuring feelings at all. It is measuring the cost of actions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it uses proxy metrics to quantify structural forces. For example, the math doesn't ask, how scared are people? It asks, What is the mathematical penalty for dissent?
That makes a lot more sense.
Right. It factors in the severity of judicial sentencing, the probability of job loss, the density of surveillance networks, and the literal monetary cost of a plane ticket out of the country. It turns coercion into a measurable vector.
So it's very pragmatic.
Very. High participation doesn't mean assent. It can be driven entirely by submission and exit friction, creating what the paper calls a theatrically stable but structurally jammed object.
A theatrically stable object.
Hmm.
Wow. So if submission is entirely driven by how hard it is to leave the pile, then the state's main job is just building higher walls to increase that exit friction.
Exactly.
And when we look at the snapshot of Russia in April 2026 from the sources, we see them building those exact walls, but digitally.
Oh, the digital walls are massive. The sources highlight incredibly specific environmental variables from this period, like WhatsApp is blocked, Telegram is severely restricted,
Right.
mobile internet is subjected to rolling localized blackouts, VPNs are aggressively suppressed, and citizens are just being pushed onto a state-backed, heavily monitored messenger called Miradas.
Which, I mean, this isn't just censorship. By physically isolating the nodes so they cannot coordinate, the state is mathematically increasing the lock surface.
You hit the nail on the head.
You can't start an avalanche if every single snowflake is locked in a separate digital box.
And the equations capture this dynamic perfectly. The paper weighs the destabilizing load, which we'll call variable U, against the stabilizing lock variable L.
Okay, U versus L.
Right. The load includes massive recent spikes in inflation, meaning violation and wartime stress. And for the average Russian public node in April 2026, that destabilizing load score is remarkably high. It sits at 0.54.
0.54. But the stabilizing lock, like the threat of being drafted,
Yeah.
the blocked VPNs, the sheer cost of resistance, that's even higher, right?
It is. The lock score calculates out to 0.675.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you subtract the load from the lock, the public failure score remains negative. It sits at negative 0.135. The public is successfully jammed.
Wait, so the math says the public is terrified and isolated, meaning they are structurally locked in place. Doesn't that mean the regime's strategy is actually working perfectly?
Well, yes and no. Coercion works on the occupancy surface, right? It keeps people showing up. But it doesn't solve the maintenance surface, which is the system's actual fatal flaw.
Because keeping a pile jammed through sheer force requires mass amounts of energy.
Coercion is incredibly expensive. And this bridges us directly from that visible occupancy surface to the hidden, decaying maintenance surface.
Right, because keeping the snowdrift visually intact requires paying an army of guards, administrators, and IT engineers to keep the VPNs blocked and the public isolated.
Exactly.
So what happens when the regime starts running out of the structural calories required to pay them?
This brings us to the maintenance reservoir. The math features a tracking equation that constantly measures whether the state is consuming its own survival capacity faster than it can restore it.
A burn rate, basically.
Yeah, exactly. This algorithm aggregates civilian economic growth, the massive drain of the war effort, labor scarcity, and fiscal reserves. If the reservoir equation dips below zero, the system is fundamentally cannibalizing itself.
And the hard economic numbers from April 2026 feeding into this reservoir are staggering. I mean, we aren't just talking about a slight dip in GDP here.
Not at all.
The sources detail a critical shortage of 2.3 million workers. There is a first-quarter budget deficit of 4.58 trillion rubles. The government is desperately planning 10% cuts to non-sensitive spending just to stay afloat.
You also have to factor in the services PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which contracted to 49.5.
Anything below 50 means the non-manufacturing economy is literally shrinking.
Right. That translates to less tax revenue, which means fewer calories entering the maintenance reservoir.
And we definitely can't ignore the most devastating drain on the human substrate, which is the casualty numbers. The sources note roughly 1.2 million total Russian casualties since 2022.
It's a massive loss.
It's a staggering human tragedy. But in the strict physics of this model, that is 1.2 million productive nodes permanently deleted from the maintenance surface.
Yes.
I mean, the state is actively pushing to recruit students and imposing strict recruitment quotas on private companies just to feed the machine.
And when you feed all of those deficits, the labor shortage, the missing nodes, the contracting PMI into the equation, the maintenance strain is pushing the structural load to its absolute breaking point.
Which begs the obvious question. If the public is jammed but the maintenance reservoir is hemorrhaging this badly, why hasn't the pile collapsed already?
Well, what's fascinating here is how external shocks can temporarily manipulate the math.
Okay, how so?
The models show that the only thing holding the reservoir above catastrophic failure right now is an expected 700 billion ruble windfall. That's roughly $9 billion in April.
Wow, 9 billion.
Yeah. And this is a massive temporary cushion generated entirely by the Iran war energy shock spiking global oil prices.
Oh, I see. So what does this all mean for you listening at home? It's like a household taking a massive pay cut, maxing out their credit cards, and suffering a medical emergency, but hiding it all because they want a scratch-off lottery ticket this month.
That is exactly what it is.
The ticket buys them a few weeks, but the math is still bleeding. It's like pouring a massive bucket of water onto a drying, crumbling sandcastle. For a brief second, the water creates this sudden surface tension that forcefully binds the sand together.
Right, it looks sturdy again.
But the water evaporates, and it doesn't change the fact that the underlying tide is actively washing the base of the castle away.
The math totally proves your sandcastle analogy. Because even with that massive $9 billion infusion artificially inflating the state's budget, the overall maintenance drift is still mathematically negative.
Still negative.
Yeah, the equation yields a drift of negative 0.064 per quarter. Even with the oil money, they are bleeding out faster than they can transfuse the system.
So if the math is bleeding, when exactly does the system run at a time? And who breaks the pile?
Well, the Gibsonian model provides a highly specific conditional projection based on these April 2026 variables. It projects what happens when the temporary surface tension of that oil bump inevitably decays.
Because commodity shocks always normalize eventually.
Exactly, while the structural drain of the war remains constant.
And the timeline?
Under those conditions, the math hits total maintenance exhaustion in exactly 5.66 quarters.
0.66 quarters.
Right. If you add the current buffered quarters they have left from the oil shock, the total window until the reservoir hits absolute zero is roughly 23 months.
Okay.
That places the critical fracture window around late 2027 to early 2028.
See, here's where it gets really interesting. Because culturally, when we imagine a regime collapsing, we always picture the public rising up. We picture a massive democratic awakening, people storming the barricades in the streets, overpowering the riot police. But mass public anger won't collapse this state, will it?
No, it actually won't. The public nodes cannot initiate the fracture because they are still structurally jammed by that 0.675 lock score we talked about.
Right, the digital walls.
Exactly. They are too isolated, too atomized by the digital blackouts, and too terrified of the retaliation load to move collectively. The physics dictate that a jammed mass cannot spontaneously unjam itself from the bottom up.
So who breaks the pile then?
The model proves that structural collapse only triggers when the elite and enforcer nodes cross their specific failure thresholds.
The guards of the pile, like the regional administrators, the fiscal planners, the tax collectors, the riot police commanders.
Exactly, the intermediaries. Right now, the math shows a representative enforcer node sitting comfortably at a failure score of negative 0.28.
Walk me through what that negative 0.28 actually means in the real world. Like, why are they so comfortable?
It means their position in the pile grants them access to the state's maintenance calories. They get a higher salary, they get immunity from the draft, they get access to better goods, and they wield authority.
So the perks heavily outweigh the stress.
Right. The perks of their position heavily outweigh the stress and load of their job.
But as that maintenance reservoir bleeds down to zero over the next 23 months, the state physically cannot afford to keep paying for that comfort. The calories run out.
Precisely. The state has to implement broader cuts. The enforcer's salary stagnates against inflation. Their immunity might be revoked.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And at the same time, the public they are tasked with controlling is getting poorer, angrier, and harder to manage. The enforcer is suddenly doing twice the work for half the structural benefit.
And when you run the predictive math on that deteriorated, calorie-starved state, the enforcer's personal failure score shifts drastically. It flips from a comfortable negative 0.28, crosses the threshold, and hits a positive 0.06.
That sign change from negative to positive is the real fracture condition of the entire system.
So we aren't waiting for a moral awakening from the guards. We literally are just waiting for the exact mathematical moment where the cost of repressing the public exceeds the paycheck they get for doing it.
That's it. It is entirely transactional. It is the brutal physics of self-preservation.
Wow.
A regime fails when prolonged maintenance decline makes the intermediaries themselves less locked into the system than the pressure acting upon them. Once that elite failure threshold hits positive 0.06, the physics of the pile demands motion. The pieces can no longer hold their current shape.
So the pile has to move. But what does that motion actually look like in reality? I mean, once that threshold is crossed, if the guards stop guarding, does the government just instantly vaporize into a liberal democracy?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Gibsonian model explicitly rules out a clean democratic uprising. There is no neat, tidy handover of power in the streets.
Because the public is still jammed in their digital boxes. They don't have the coordination to form a new government.
Exactly. Because the base is jammed, the collapse has to come from the top down, driven by those elite and enforcer nodes scrambling for a new equilibrium. The math predicts a chaotic process of redistribution.
Redistribution, what does that look like on the ground?
It looks like quiet, localized rebellion. Regional fiscal withholding, where local governors realize Moscow can no longer enforce tax collection, so they simply stop sending revenue back to the capital.
They just keep the calories for themselves.
Exactly. And it looks like the selective abandonment of outlying obligations. The state stops repairing roads or funding hospitals in the outer provinces just to protect the core infrastructure in the major cities.
It's the, what do they call it, neo-feudalization of security.
Yes. When the macrostructure can no longer afford to maintain its own gravity, local leaders and oligarchs start hoarding resources and hiring private security to protect their own localized fiefdoms.
So going back to our physical analogies, the state stops acting like one massive coordinated pile of sand. Instead, the surface tension breaks, and it abruptly fractures into a dozen smaller piles. You get local warlords or regional governors fortifying their own smaller structures, just trying to find a local stability basin where their personal equation stays negative.
The physics of the Gibsonian model show that structural collapse is rarely an explosion. It is much more often a localized fragmentation.
This is just such a profoundly different way to look at human society.
Mm.
To recap the journey we've been on today, when you stop looking at a country as a collection of political opinions and start viewing it as a Gibsonian accumulation object, the entire paradigm shifts.
It really does.
It reveals that visible compliance, that occupancy surface we see on the news, is nothing but a theatrical illusion if the hidden maintenance surface is mathematically decaying.
And for the Russian Federation in April 2026, the data shows a public completely jammed by fear and digital isolation. But the underlying caloric resources required to maintain that massive coercive jam are bleeding out.
Bleeding out fast.
Yeah, and the mathematics point with chilling precision to the elites and enforcers hitting their absolute breaking point by late 2027 or early 2028, assuming the current variables hold.
The ultimate takeaway here is that political stability has almost nothing to do with the volume of public opinion or the ideological purity of the masses. It is strictly about structural viability under load. A system only survives if it can continuously reproduce its own human substrate.
Right.
It's the difference between a building that is structurally sound and a building that is standing perfectly still while quietly being hollowed out by termites inside the walls.
And this raises an important question about how we view stability everywhere. This math doesn't only govern authoritarian regimes.
It governs every human pile. That brings me to a final thought for you listening right now. We've just spent this deep dive applying an incredibly intense physics model to a coercive regime under extreme wartime strain. We looked at how blocked VPNs create exit friction and how economic deficits drain the maintenance reservoir until the guards finally flip.
But the mathematics of occupancy versus hidden maintenance apply to any complex human structure.
Exactly. They apply to giant multinational corporations, to legacy institutions, and yes, even to open democracies.
Every society has an occupancy surface, and every society has a maintenance reservoir.
So I want to leave you with this to mull over. If you applied this exact mathematical framework, the Gibsonian physics of accumulation objects, to your own country's political system right now, what would the equations reveal? What hidden structural decay, what slow draining of the maintenance reservoir might be lurking just beneath the visible, theatrically stable surface of your own society?
Thank you for exploring the mechanics of dominion and collapse with us today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the surface.